Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the revamped Geezerology. And back in the day, we had a segment of Geezerology that we called Bob's Book Club. And we are resurrecting that. And this time, the books are going to relate to the movie industry. And I came across a fascinating book called Pre-Code Essentials. And knowing that my compatriot Bill also lives in a black and white world, I turned the book onto him. He got a copy of it. So today, Bill and I are going to go through this book, which details some of the better movies that came out of what we call the pre-code era. And this was prior to July 1st, 1934, when the production code went into effect. And basically, not basically, but essentially from that time on, all movies had to be approved through this code. So all scripts had to be submitted. They were censored, and then if your script got approval, you went and shot your film, and then the film had to be submitted. The finished product had to be submitted again for censorship before it could get released to the public. This book was written by Kim Luperi and Danny Reed in association with Turner Classic Movies. Now, the two authors also do a podcast around this subject, and they also have a website called pre-code.com. So if you're not into reading, you can also get a lot of this information through their podcast or by going to the website. At this time, I want to kick it over to Bill. I know you're an aficionado. Boy, that's a mispronunciation of these classic movies. So, Bill, you want to kick in here for a little bit?
Sure, Bob. Yes, thanks a lot. I am intrigued by pre-code movies because I'm familiar with the concept, and I think anybody who's a film fan has probably got a working knowledge of the fact that the movies, especially in the immediate post-sound age, which would have been 1927 on, dealt with all kinds of topics that were kind of racy or violent, or in other kind of definitions sort of questionable for audiences, at least how you might assume that they would be produced. And the fact that many times, if you come across them, a pre-code movie tends to surprise you with its frankness or the topics that are being presented. So it really illustrates in many ways how movies, even if they're they seem old and black and white, as you mentioned, or kind of antiquated, really are quite modern in many ways, and in some real instances are quite ahead of their time, even ahead of our time today. So I was intrigued when Bob mentioned this book. Anything under the auspices of Turner Classic Movies is something that immediately appeals to me, because I know as a TCM fan, the kind of focus on detail and accuracy that comes across in both the channel itself and anything that's produced by its publishing arm. So from my standpoint, again, as a guy who is somewhat aware of pre-code, and I've seen a number of pre-code movies, I thought I had a pretty good knowledge of the background of this. What this book is really great at is that it's set up chronologically, and it's very specifically is dealing with 50 films that the authors have picked as kind of representative of the pre-code issues and topics. And then they did it chronologically. So you go through this and you can see how a code that essentially had been put together by the studios to try to protect themselves and their investments from outside audiences and groups that were kind of protesting, to one level or another about what was being manufactured in Hollywood and then distributed out to the public. So you had these groups like the Catholic Legion of Decency or other local or state kind of organizations that were picketing or gathering protest signatures for, you know, either state level or congressional action. And the studios wanted to head this off. And so they determined that probably the best way to do it was to self-censor themselves. And they thought, you know, if we put together a code that addresses these things, and then we get a kind of an honest broker, somebody whose name is recognized, you know, at large, and then put this person in charge, you know, we'll go through this process of making sure that everything meets the code. And the code basically is addressing those things that I mentioned at the beginning, which is violence, you know, making sure that villains don't get away with crimes, that sex is dealt with in a very muted way, and that, you know, passions are not aroused by what's being shown on screen or the topics being dealt with. So that was what was, you know, formally established. So the studios could say, yes, we have a process, and that way we can assure everybody at large that what we make is going to be okay. In fact, however, for this period between the code being formally developed in about 1930 and being explicitly put into action in 1934, the middle of 1934, an enormous number of movies were made. Of course, this was in the depths of the Depression by studios that were trying to make money. And the topics that they dealt with, either, you know, in an artful way or in a salacious way or in a gratuitous way, ranged all across the board. And many of these films, which still exist today in one form or another, went through the process and, you know, by being reviewed by this studio-approved, entity, would have to make some changes, and they were trying to make these changes in advance of the production of the movies going out to, distribution to the States. And what is great about the book is that not only does it flow, you know, picture by picture, and each picture is dealt with very specifically. There's a synopsis of the movie, talks about the action, the actors and actresses involved, how the movie was put together. But then there's documentation. In many cases, it's really, you know, copies of letters and other things that are being cited that show what happens when movies get released, and then there's blowback that at different states requires different things to be done, and you start to get a handle on how some locales would really be objecting to certain things, and in other cases wouldn't really have any issues at all. So really, it's kind of an enlightening thing. It gave me a much better idea of how this thing kind of unfolded. I was surprised, and Bob, maybe you have a insight into this, at the, I won't say laxity, but Kansas seemed to have a very, loose kind of interpretation of many movies that were objectionable in other states. The only thing that seemed to get Kansas, the censor boards upset was excessive drinking, but they didn't seem to be too head up about, you know, sex or violence. So I don't know if that's just kind of a nice Midwestern approach to the reality of things, or whether it was really contingent on what was happening at a state level.
Well, yeah, interesting, Bill, because I learned a lot of things here that I did not know. And one thing that really surprised me was that movies at this time did not have First Amendment rights. And the Supreme Court had actually ruled that they were entertainment. So it wasn't until sometime in the 1950s that the Supreme Court reversed that decision. So that meant that, as you pointed out, one town could block a film from being released while another town would show it, and some would demand certain scenes to be cut and stuff. So yeah, it was driving the movie studios crazy, especially since they own the theaters. Now, I don't know specifically why, you know, Kansas might react differently, and this is not meant in any way to be derogatory, but a lot of what I've researched and read is apparently a lot of this was driven by the Catholic Church. And you mentioned the Catholic League of Decency. So that appeared to be one of the big, powerful forces behind the backlash to the movies. So I don't know whether maybe Kansas wasn't as powerful with Catholicism or not. I don't know. But the authors of the book, and they're saying that Hollywood in the 1920s was rocked by a lot of big scandals. And of course, we had the jazz age throughout the country. And this, where morals were loosened and drinking and all of the things that went on during that period. So there was kind of a backlash to the scandals that rocked Hollywood. And then when the Great Depression hit, there was a knee-jerk reaction with a lot of people saying, oh my God, all the things you guys did in the 20s caused this to happen. So, and then, spurred by the Catholic League of Decency, some other people, you got started to get that backlash to what Hollywood was putting out. And so, as Bill mentioned, in the Depression, going to a movie was, do I buy a loaf of bread or do I go to a movie? So the studios were looking for ways to get people back into the theater. So, putting out these films with, the sexual innuendos and a lot of other things was an effort to try to get people into the theater. However, I think a lot of what was done during this period wasn't all just for the dollar. There was a lot of social commentary in these films. So I learned a lot from reading this book that I wasn't aware of. And, I knew there was a code and I knew that it existed, but it wasn't until a couple months ago that I read a book about the movies made by director Walter Huston and actor Humphrey Bogart that I really learned just how overriding this code was, because this book detailed all of the hoops that people had to go through to get these movies approved. And I mean, the code enforcers would go really deep into the weeds, pouring through these scripts and things. So it was quite an arduous process for a filmmaker to get something approved, to be shot and then to be released. I also did not know that this code was in effect until 1968. Which really surprised me. I thought it was just a thing of, the 30s, but it was there for a long, long time. And of course, the filmmakers of the 60s really started pushing those boundaries again, and the code was eventually dropped. The authors of the book picked the 50 most essential films from this period that they think are, worth viewing. And like Bill said, fascinating stories about the films, the censorship that they hit, and also when, after the code went into effect, formally enforced July 1st, 1934, if these films got re-released, suddenly they had to be cleaned up, to be re-released under the code. A lot of fascinating stuff in here. And for example, there was a film called I Was a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which was a very graphic portrayal of the brutality of Georgia chain gangs. And it was based on the true story of a person who managed to escape from the chain gang. Well, the movie so infuriated the state of Georgia that the book claims that Georgia officials said that they would kill the director and the major stars if they ever set foot in Georgia. And then like the economic woes of the Great Depression were covered in some of these films, and there are details. One scene where it's a film about the impact of the Depression. There's a scene where the actors are sitting around saying, boy, is this the end of America? So it touched on the economic woes. It pushed the boundaries of sexuality. For example, the film Tarzan and His Mate, which was the second film with Olympic swimmer Johnny Weissmuller playing Tarzan. And in this, actress Maureen O'Sullivan throughout the whole film is in this very skimpy jungle outfit. And then there's the famous scene where the Tarzan actor and his mate Jane swim nude in the water. Now, it wasn't actress Maureen O'Sullivan actually in the water. There was a stand-in for her. And it wasn't because she was opposed to the nude part. She said in a later interview she was claustrophobic and couldn't stand the idea of going under the water, so they had to have somebody stand in for her. And then we have a film with Marlene Dietrich, Open Lesbianism. So yeah, the filmmakers of this time really pushed the boundaries, and as Bill said, they touched on topics that are still absolutely relevant today, which I guess falls back to the old cliche of the more things change, the more they stay the same. So,
yeah, I think one of the most exotic kind of well, there's two that really struck my mind, neither of which I've seen, and I think both are kind of hard to see to find actually. One of them is Madam Satan, which is kind of a crazy movie where a wife loses her husband to this girlfriend that he's got, because it's quite clearly established that she is a more adventurous lover. And so the wife tells the girlfriend that she is going to out debauch her and win her husband back. And so she disguises herself in a costume, and it's kind of like Eyes Wide Shut kind of thing. And it's like an orgiastic thing where there's a bidding for women, and the husband bids and wins Madam Satan, who he finds out in the end is his wife. It's kind of crazy, and it sounds very intriguing. I would love to see this. The other movie that is also kind of nuts is called Gabriel Over the White House, which has Walter Houston, and you mentioned John Huston, his son, directing Bogart, but Walter Houston plays this guy who gets elected president, and he's clearly incapable of being president. I mean, he's kind of a nutty character, and he's more interested in chasing women and drinking. He gets into an accident, and miraculously, Gabriel comes and kind of changes his whole attitude, and he all of a sudden becomes this, very strong, domineering guy who's got a clear-cut sense of what he wants to do, and he decides he's going to disband Congress, and he starts ruling as an authoritarian executive, and straightens a lot of things out, and people are very happy with what's transpired. In the end, he goes through another situation where all of that stuff gets reversed. He goes back to his normal self again, and I can't remember exactly how it ends, but it's somewhat tragic, of course. So you can imagine this is a movie, pre Franklin Roosevelt, just on that cusp, where it's clear that Herbert Hoover, the president at the time, is not being able to do anything to mitigate the depression, and in many cases has done things which, while he's got some support for, most people are against. So he, for example, sends the army to attack the Bonus Army, which is a large group of World War I veterans who were promised a bonus, but the bonus doesn't come due until sometime in the 40s, and they're saying, well, it doesn't matter when it's due, we need it now. And so they march on Washington. They camp, outside of Capitol Hill, and Hoover sends, General MacArthur at the time, and essentially the cavalry to disperse the Bonus Army. And the Bonus Army turns up in a lot of these movies as kind of a stand-in for just how bad things are in the country. And so you can see that it's both, kind of torn from the headlines of today, but also something that the code pushes back on a lot, which is saying you're being disparaging toward America or the government's ability to help people. And yet people realize that things are bad and things, something different needs to happen. So Gabriel Over the White House is one of these things where, well, maybe the strongman solution is one of the things that we're going to, try, instead of this whole democracy, where nothing seems to be accomplished. The other thing, Bob, you mentioned this, and I really had no idea about that at all, which was the revisionism of movies that had already been released, that had box office success, were back in the studio's libraries, and the common custom was, after 3 or 4 years, let's re-release them because many people hadn't seen them or they want to see them again. They had to go through this production code, which was now rigorously enforced. And so things that people had seen 3 years ago, they were no longer allowed to see. So they would, excise chunks of movie, footage. For example, there was a comedy with these two guys who I can't remember their names. That's how Woolsey is one of them, but I don't remember the guy's name. They go to Africa, and the whole thing it's kind of an insane thing. All of the natives are Amazons. They all happen to be attractive chorus girls, which is kind of a interesting thing. There's the very strong indication that one of the guys is being pursued by a gorilla who wants to mate with him. So this is very odd. Anyway, the movie was 90 minutes long or thereabouts. It got chopped down to 60 minutes, where it no longer made any sense at all because all of the chops, kind of eliminated the payoffs to the jokes, and it was kind of a crazy thing. So it was interesting to see the retroactive application of the code, then decimating movies that had already been seen. And it also, today even, the result is that there are movies in different states of final versions that makes it hard for, film historians or viewers to be able to see and get a handle on. Anyway, but for people who are interested in pre-code movies, this is a great way to kind of immerse yourself in it, to follow the process through, to see firsthand documentation. I really enjoyed seeing some of these letters from studio executives or from the board back to them saying, here's what you've got to do, or please, let us pursue this. We're doing this in an artful way. It's one thing to be told that the code had a lot of impact. It's another thing to see the source material that documents what's going on and how it happened to come to be at this stage. So I give a lot of credit to the way the book's put together. The authors do a good job of not just kind of collecting the information and presenting it, but they have their own editorial opinion about certain things, and they point out the parallels between today and the past. As we were saying, many of these things, authoritarianism, sexuality, violence, illegal, in our case today, it's drugs, but it was alcohol and drugs. All of that stuff is, relevant today. And it's interesting to see how I guess at this point, our grandparents, great-grandparents, as audience members, saw this and how their peers produced it.
These movies are worth seeing, not because they're racy or sexy or whatever, but they're worth seeing because many of them were very well made, and especially with the limitations of what cinematography could do back in that time. So please don't think, hey, I just want to go see this because there's gratuitous nudity or something. No, many of them are really, really good films, and they're worth seeing for that reason. And let me give you an example. There's a film in here called Flying Down to Rio, and it's one of the first films with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. But I was reading about the film, and it talked about how they had chorus girls on the wings of airplanes dancing, and the wind is ripping off their clothes. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I want to see this. All right, my period nature kicked in. So I found that clip on YouTube, and I was watching it going, oh my God, did they actually put these dancers on planes? Because I knew wing walking was a thing back in that era. I mean, it looks that realistic. So then I went back and read further, and no, they filmed it in a studio with about 4 feet off the ground. But even with limited technology of the time, it looks like they're really flying on a plane, So I'm pretty impressed by this. I mean, in a time today when we can do almost anything with computer generated imaging, to me, that was pretty impressive. So I love a lot of these old films because, these were pioneers. They were there first with the camera angles and setting up, everything that they did on a technical basis. And in fact, the movie King Kong is in here. And if you think about the Kong ape, that was what, stop motion, where they had to, to move every time they had Kong moving, they were repositioning it, and all that. So, pretty miraculous movie making for the time. And while I think today most of us would be appalled at the idea of censorship, there was a positive to all of this. And what it did was, if filmmakers wanted to get a message across, they had to become very creative on how they got that message across. And I've used this example, before, but in the Lauren Bacall, Humphrey Bogart movie, To Have and to Have Not, there's a scene where Bacall is standing in the doorway and Bogart's, I think, in his motel room or something. And, she says, if you need me, just whistle. You know how to whistle, don't you? You put your lips together and blow. And that is such a sexually suggestive scene. And just by the way she says those words and stuff. So it's like, wow, I mean, there's no nudity or nothing, but man, does that get a message across, and I'm sure, so the people making this film probably had to do a lot of tweaking to get that past the censors. So they had to become, in many cases, if they really wanted to put forth a statement, they had to get very creative. So probably in some ways it made them better filmmakers. And I saw that when I was reading the book about Huston and Bogart, and all of the times they had to go back and revise and resubmit their scripts, to get things past the board. So fascinating period, I think, in Hollywood history. And I heartily recommend the book if you're interested in that era. Again, it's called Pre-Code Essentials, Must-See Cinema from Hollywood's Untamed Era. These old films are worth seeing. A lot of them were very well put together, and very creative, and I love watching them because I'm just so impressed with how they did these things with, like I said earlier, the limited technology. Bill, any final thoughts?
I second your recommendation. The thing that is important from my perspective is that some of the greatest directors and stars who are still known today are in these movies. So Barbara Stanwyck and Myrna Loy, Frederick March, people who you would recognize, and then a lot of people who've been forgotten, who deserve to have recognition for the work they've done. I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang has Paul Muni in it, and he is really fantastic in this movie. I've seen it a few times. Mm-hmm. But he's not really a well-known person these days. I would say that the movies are worthwhile because of all of the things we've talked about. And I think the more of them you see, the better you can appreciate, just how these movies from that era have affected us today. And the book does a great job of doing that. So I recommend it as well.
Did you enjoy this video? If so, please smash that subscribe button and drop a comment to let us know what you think about the movie we just discussed. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on Geezerology 2.0.